what is happening now, which I know is very painful to many Israelis, including to myself. I think instinctually we're people who seek agreement and seek cohesion, and that's very, very important for Israel. But there's also a real opportunity here for Israel to work through issues that we've kind of neglected perhaps over the last few decades, questions of identity or constitutionalism. But also we need to bear in mind that many of the challenges that we are facing, if we can make meaningful progress on those in Israel, we'll actually have a lot of really important lessons for the world.
Yeah. So today on our podcast, we are hosting Professor Amichai Magen. He's a visiting scholar at Stanford University and the inaugural fellow in the Israel Studies. He's also a professor at Reichman University. He's the head of the MA program. And in our conversation, we covered a little bit of his own personal story and what it was like to grow up in the 70s and 80s in Israel on the heels of the Yom Kippur War and the son of immigrants from different parts of the world and how that influenced and impacted who he is professionally and personally. We covered a little bit about the development of liberal democracies and their kind of thriving until the early 2000s, and what are the ingredients of those liberal democracies. And then, of course, we went in to discuss a little bit more about what's happening in Israel today with the judicial overhaul, and what are the different sides maybe of people who are proponents or who oppose it. And of course, what are the ingredients of a liberal democracy? And all that comes up in the broader context of shifts that we're seeing maybe in the globe. So that's the episode today with Professor Amichai Magen. Take a listen. Please follow us on all your favorite platforms, podcast platforms, social media, and our newsletter, of course. And we hope you enjoy this episode. Welcome, Dr. Amichai Magen, Professor Amichai Magen. It's great to have you here on our Z3 podcast.
It's great to be here.
Really, it's wonderful. Professor Amichai Magen is a visiting scholar at Stanford University and the inaugural fellow at the Israel Center, or the Israel Studies, more precisely, and also the head of the MA program at Reichman University at the Lauder School in conflict resolution and strategy, right? Did I get that right?
Diplomacy and conflict studies.
Diplomacy and conflict studies. It's always a mouthful, these big, these titles. I have to remember the whole thing. But anyway, it's really great to have you here, especially because we've known each other for
a long time.
Yeah,
Since we both had hair.
Yes, exactly. I mean, I still kind
You're still good.
I kind of pretend it's still there, but if I'm being honest, it's on its way out. But but really, it's great. You just moved here recently, right?
Just came back.
Just came back, actually, right? So let's what we typically do in these conversations. I'd like to get to know myself as well, more so in our audience, to hear more about your background, your professional background, your personal kind of your origin story almost. And then, we'll take it from there. But I'd love to, if we can start a little bit.
Great. Yeah. So thank you. It's wonderful to be here, and it's wonderful to reconnect with the Israeli community, the broader the Jewish community in the Bay Area. This is actually Merav and Merav being my better half, our second period of time here in the Bay Area. The first was between 2002 and 2009. So we had 7 amazing years.
Wow.
And then we've been back in Israel for the last 14, so it's almost biblical, right? It's 7 and 14. And I did my PhD at Stanford. Merav worked for a law firm here in the Bay Area, and we had 7 fantastic years here. We went back to Israel in 2009. I've been a scholar primarily at what used to be IDC and now Reichman University for the last 14 years, working on issues of democracy and rule of law and statehood and sovereignty and all these irrelevant things that have nothing to do with what's happening in Israel today or in the world. And over the last few years, I've really kind of headed 2 programs at the Lauder School of Government, Diplomacy and Strategy. One is our MA program in Diplomacy and Conflict Studies. It's an amazing program that brings together about 50 or 60 students from all around the world to Israel to study diplomacy and geopolitics and conflict management. Usually we manage conflicts and don't resolve them. Yeah. And more recently, from 2019, I had an inkling that we really needed to invest more in our educational programs having to do with democratic resilience.
Okay.
And so together with a German...
With Reichman University.
We at Reichman University,
yeah, okay.
and specifically the Lauder School of Government that helps train the future leadership of Israel in the area of government, we established the program on democratic development and resilience, which I directed until coming back to Stanford, to really work on these questions of how do we make Israeli democracy stronger and more resilient? How do we adapt to the various domestic but also international challenges that all democracies are facing in the international system today? So that's as a sort of a professional background. Personally, very, very briefly, I'm the child of two refugees, one from Nazi Germany and one from the Soviet Union. My parents made Aliyah to Israel in the late 1960s. I was born right after the Yom Kippur War. That's why I have this very super patriotic name, Amichai Magen, and that legacy, I think, of a family history of knowing what it's like to live under totalitarian regimes, and knowing how precious freedom is, how precious national self-determination for the Jewish people is. Those are things that really, I think, undergird a lot of my professional work, but also my thinking about the importance of Israel and Jewish peoplehood internationally. So that's just a little bit of professional and personal background. We're back because Stanford University, my alma mater, asked me to come here to help them establish an Israel Studies program, which is an amazing thing. We have an Israel Studies program at Berkeley, as you know, headed by the wonderful Ron Hassner and then Ken Bamberger. They've done an amazing job in building a vibrant Israel Studies community across the Bay. And so Stanford cannot be outdone by Berkeley in anything, including this. And so it's just an amazing opportunity, which I couldn't say no to come and try to help Stanford establish what is now a pilot, but will hopefully become an endowed and permanent Israel Studies program.
That's awesome.
So that's
super,
the mission.
That's super exciting, and really we're so lucky in our community to have you back in the neighborhood. Also personally, but also as a community. You raised already all kinds of interesting threads that I'm excited to pull and see where they lead us. But I want to actually start before we get into like the more heavy topic of the day and your area of expertise. You did tie it in kind of into your own personal story, and I'm curious to hear a little bit more about what it meant, to grow up, with that legacy, that weight, also, of the parents, also the Israel that you were born into and grew up in. Like, maybe give us a peek into what that felt like, and just kind of like enlighten us or share with us a little bit of that. So
yeah, I think one way to think about this is that I grew up with a very strong sense that freedom wasn't free, that peace and prosperity and life as a free and responsible human being was a kind of miracle, which had to be nurtured day after day, that has to be defended, that we couldn't be sort of complacent about it. I think that if you're born in an open and free society, and especially if you were born into a family that was lucky enough to live in an open society, in a free society for 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 generations, it's very, very easy to fall into the trap of believing that is a solid, permanent thing. And I think what we're discovering in Israel today, but again, not just in Israel, in the United States and all around the world, is that the open order, the free society that has given us so many blessings in terms of life expectancy and health and wealth and demographic growth and peace and stability and life opportunities for creativity, that is incredibly precious, but also more fragile than we've suspected. And I always kind of grew up with that feeling. And I think that was especially true in Israel. because, as you know, Amitai, very well, unlike the United States, in Israel, we don't have the luxury of living from sea to shining sea. Right. We always know that the borders are close and that they can be very precarious. We know that our margin of error and our margin of survival is much smaller, narrower than it is in the United States. And so I think, particularly in Israel, the quality of leadership, the quality of governance is so critically important. I believe it was Shimon Peres, Zichrono Livracha, who once said that Israel could not afford to be a kind of mediocre country. Israel would either be excellent, including in governance and leadership, or it will not be. And so I think those are some of the experiences and the ideas that have kind of driven me to focus on these issues, because I had a sense going back for a long time that Israel has the human capital and the strength and the spirit to pretty much deal with every external threat that could come our way, including the Iranian threat. But in order for us to be able to survive and thrive, we need to be coherent and we need to be effective and we need to govern well and competently and freely within Israel. And we need sufficient wisdom and courage and cohesion in order to make sure that Israel is able to generate the will and the capacities to deal with the various external threats that we face. And I think it's not that I was a prophet in any way, but I think there's always been a sense of the importance of internal togetherness and cohesiveness, of arvut adadit, right? Of being
mutuality and that connection between people.
And that connection between various parts of Israeli society. But those bonds have been tested more and more. I would say for the last 30 years or so. And so we saw this coming. We didn't realize the crisis was going to arrive so quickly and so dramatically. But I think people who study Israeli society have understood that we really need to invest much more in making sure that Israel remains cohesive and coherent internally, and that is going to be a major challenge for us going forward.
So you're describing, I mean, that arc that you described, right, is like it's fascinating to hear, you know, because I'm sure it resonates with many people, like this very a sense of a very personal narrative that's informed by you know the stories that we inherit from our parents. The lived experience that we have, you know, around us, if it's a war that just passed, or that constant kind of alertness or recognition that something's about to happen, and how that very much creates like a connection, a mission, almost a mission-driven focus, right, for people. You know, I'd venture to say, regardless of the industry, but you know, we could talk about that also. But what you're describing for your own personal journey was very much from the beginning this understanding, this recognition that there is that there isn't a you know that everything can be conditional, right? And that so far we have to work continuously to maintain it and upkeep it and uphold it. It's not something that's kind of like, you know, a given, right? It's like not taking it for granted almost.
Right, especially when you love something as deeply and something is as precious as the state of Israel, something that we've worked for and we've sacrificed for so long. That I think imposes a special responsibility. You know, maintaining a democracy, or at least a state in a place like Norway or Luxembourg is one thing. But to do it in the Middle East, in a place like Israel, it's really a tall order. And so again, we can't afford to be complacent. And I feel that in some respects, Israel's tremendous success over the last 3 or 4 decades has made us a little complacent. We've sort of started to take a lot of things for granted. And paradoxically, as we've become a wealthier, more individualistic, more powerful state that has achieved levels of economic development that are on par with Western Europe, but also as we've enlarged the circle of peace. we've allowed a little bit of complacency to creep in, and I think we're paying the price for it now. I don't think it's catastrophic yet. I don't think it's disastrous yet. I'm bullish on Israel.
Yeah, okay.
I'm optimistic on Israel, but we have a lot of work to do.
Yeah.
And when I say we, I mean not only people who now live and work and serve in the army and pay taxes in Israel, but I would say the Jewish people all around the world, because it's our collective home and our collective dream.
For sure, yeah, absolutely. That very much resonates. I want to drill down for a moment on some of the things that you raised in no particular order. I just want to name them for a second. I'm very interested to kind of explore this, specifically in Israel, what's going on, and in particular, like what in 2019 kind of like, got your spidey senses tingling. That's one piece. You also very quickly connected it to the international arena. So I want to kind of, talk about that also in a minute. And the third thing I hope that we're able to cover is this, you kind of, in passing, mentioned some things that admittingly I read a memo you wrote. So I was able to now identify them, right? But this idea of like, eras or periods of stasis in a cyclical kind of progression of liberal democracies across, over time is a piece that comes up there. This idea of like a shared narrative and a goal that people are working towards, the idea of systems and mechanisms of governance that are and the legitimacy of those systems, and that's kind of something that I was kind of hearing between the lines. So let's start first with Israel. Like maybe give us like a 2-minute version for the uninitiated, like what happened last week, I believe, with this new law that was ratified. We'll try to keep it focused because I know there's a lot, but what that is, and then like what is that indication of something broader that's happening maybe, and kind of go from there.
So I think to understand the political moment that we're living through at the moment, and the sense of anxiety that a lot of Israelis have about the current situation, I think we sort of need to step back and to identify just very briefly the tremendous strengths of Israeli democracy, but also the vulnerabilities. And I think that will give us the context through which we can understand the current situation. So let's start with the kind of historical institutional context, and I'd like to say a few things. So one of the important things to say is that in Israel we tend to think about ourselves as a young country, and in some respects that is true. We've just celebrated 75 years of Israeli independence, but that actually makes us one of the oldest democracies in the world.
Interesting.
In 1948, there were fewer than 20 democracies in the world. And there are very, very few, today, depending how you count, we have about 115, 120.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So we've been through this kind of global democratic boom, but it also means that most democracies in the world are actually newer democracies than Israel. Right? That's an interesting point.
I haven't thought of that, yeah.
So that's a point of strength. The other point of strength is that we are actually one of literally a handful of countries in the world that has never experienced a military coup or other kind of authoritarian takeover. It's very interesting.
Yeah.
That's not true of Germany. That's not true of France.
Yeah.
But with all the wars and the security challenges, the hyperinflation of the 1980s, the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, the multiple elections we've been having over the last 5 years, Israeli democracy held.
Yeah.
And so we have a history of resilience, of democratic resilience. And that is something we need to remember because it helps us, it gives us strength, it gives us hope, and it gives us a sense of history. But it also tells us what we're in danger of losing, right? If we,
the price to pay.
If, heaven forbid, Israeli democracy were to erode and to fall apart, it would be a political event on par with British or American or Canadian or French democracy falling apart. Because Israel, again, is one of the oldest democracies in the world, and it's proven to be very, very resilient. It's also proved to be very resilient under very tough conditions. If you think about it, Israel is a kind of democratic miracle because there are no other democracies in the Middle East.
Right.
Usually, democracies that exist in democratic neighborhoods have a much easier time of it. That is not the case in Israel. Israel is a country whose leadership did not come from Philadelphia or from Westminster, right?
Yeah.
It came primarily from societies that did not have a very strong democratic tradition. That's also true of the majority of the Israeli population.
Yeah.
Think about, for example, my wife's family who came from Morocco. A majority of Israelis who immigrated to Israel, again, did not come from, from England or from Canada. As important as those aliyot are, but they came from Iraq and Iran and Egypt and Libya and Morocco and Algeria and Tunisia.
FSU, also the former Soviet Union.
Yeah, exactly. They came from Russia, they came from Ukraine, they came from Belarus. So it's an amazing thing, creating a democratic society with a leadership and a population who primarily came from non-democratic societies. It's an amazing achievement. It's a tremendous miracle, and it's something that we should take great pride in. On the other hand, we have tremendous vulnerabilities in Israeli democracy, part of which are cultural, part of which sort of derive from the fact that we don't have a 300 or 400 year kind of tradition of gradual, incremental democratic development. But partly institutional. And it's a kind of an accident, it's a sort of a constitutional accident or an accident of politics that when you sort of zoom back and look at Israeli democracy, it actually has very, very few formal safeguards on the preservation of democracy. Israel has relied upon what Alexis de Tocqueville or Montesquieu famously called mores, or values or norms of what is done and not done in politics. We took that from the British tradition, but unlike the British tradition, unlike the current British system, we are not subject to the supervision of international courts. We don't have local constituencies. We don't have federalism. We don't have two chambers of the legislature. We have one Knesset, right? So there's a whole bunch of mechanisms that exist in other democracies, whether that's Canada, Australia, the United States, or Britain, that simply don't exist in Israel, okay? And so for many decades, we've sort of relied on an internal togetherness and cohesion and biyachad, togetherness, and we've relied on norms of what is done and not done in politics. And we actually didn't codify a constitution. We didn't really put in place formal checks and balances to ensure the separation of powers in Israel. And because the Israeli political system is derivative from the British Westminster model, it also means that there's no real separation of powers in Israel between the executive, between the government on the one hand, and then the legislature, the Knesset, on the other. Whoever controls the government controls the Knesset. Whoever controls the Knesset controls the government, okay? All of that is to say that the only major formal check on the power of the executive in Israel is the Supreme Court, or more accurately in Israel, what I would describe as the Israeli legal establishment, which includes the judiciary, but also includes a very powerful attorney general and various legal counsels, legal advisors to the Israeli ministries. And again, and what's interesting about that legal establishment is that it is unusually powerful. The opinion of the Attorney General in Israel is legally binding on elected officials and appointed officials, but from a democratic theory point of view, what matters is like elected officials, unless and until the Supreme Court rules otherwise. So it's a very, very powerful legal establishment. And so that, I think, helps us understand the context and the topography of the current clash that is happening in Israel between those who say, hey, the government is elected to govern, and we now have the majority, and why should we be told by unelected judges what should be the policy of the government? So that's one narrative. And on the other hand, you have many Israelis who sort of say, hey, but we need to understand the absolute importance of separation of powers. And in the context of the Israeli reality, which may not be ideal, but it is what it is, the only effective check on unbridled state power is the Supreme Court and the legal establishment. So we may need to renegotiate that. We may need some kind of constitutional settlement, but until we have a comprehensive constitutional settlement, or at least sort of broad national agreement, what should be the rules of the game, let's be very careful about the changes that we're trying to make, because if we go too far in limiting the power of the Supreme Court, in breaking and curtailing the authority of the gatekeepers, what we in Israel call Shomrei Hasaf, the people who can exercise some kind of check on executive power, we're going to find ourselves in a situation where effectively we have one authority, and that means that we're no longer a democracy.
So that's incredibly helpful and useful. And you said something that to me, as someone who follows these things relatively closely, like you said, this understanding that in theory there are three arms of government, right? But in practice in Israel, there's really only two, right? And because there's really only, if there was a third, almost like in a Talmudic sense, right? The third will come and kind of separate. Like, because there's really two, every even what we might objectively identify as like a minor change can disrupt the entire system. And that's basically what those who are opposing the judiciary overhaul are saying. But the inverse is saying, excuse me, we were elected and this is our prerogative. We can do this.
Right. And that is why, again, paradoxically, what conservative political thinkers and conservative constitutional scholars will say to you, they'll say, be very careful about tinkering with the system because of the law of unintended consequences, because you don't know which way this is going to go, and be especially careful in breaking a system that has delivered so much good to the state of Israel.
The paradox that you're capturing is that theoretically the conservative legal scholars who would maybe align with one political side would say, yes, except that the foundation of our approach is saying, let's maintain, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Right?
They would say two things. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Have respect for a system that has worked. Again, it's far from perfect. We can get into the weeds if you want about judicial activism, more or less, etc. We could spend a lot of time on that. But first, do no harm. And if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Have respect for a system that's delivered great outputs for Israel over the last 75 years. And never forget the law of unintended consequences. You legislate now, you legislate in haste, and if you legislate without broad national agreement, there are going to be unintended consequences, and there will be a backlash. And I think that's kind of what we're experiencing at the moment.
So I want to put this first. I want to hold this for a minute, and then I want to take, but also the broad view. You said you mentioned several times that this is a moment in that we're seeing globally, maybe. So maybe like a minute or two on like what, where, and like the dots that you're connecting, and then I want to talk a little bit about, if possible, those four elements that we kind of brought up, and like the fact that those seem to be deteriorating, is that what people are lamenting as the end of Israeli society, democracy, etc., or is it something else? But we'll see. We're trying to be mindful. But so the global, and then
okay. So if we sort of zoom out and think about the fate of Israeli democracy in a broader international context, our starting point has to be going back to this idea that Israel, even though we think about ourselves as a very young country, is actually one of the oldest democracies in the world, right? So if we sort of look at the world in 1948, so immediate post-Second World War period, very few democracies. Most of the world is authoritarian, whether that's the Soviet Union or communist China. All of Latin America was authoritarian. All of Asia, with the exception of Japan, that was just emerging from the catastrophe of the Second World War. And we had a whole bunch of new states created in the international system, including India, Pakistan, etc. So that is the context into which Israel was born. And what happened in that period, and especially since the mid-1970s, is what we describe as the global democratic boom. So from a situation where democracies were actually the exception in the international system rather than the norm, we went from a situation, just to give you the numbers, where in 1974, there were about 38, 39 democracies in the world. That represented about 26, 27% of the countries in the world. By the year 2000, there was a complete sea change in that. And we had this huge global democratic boom, much of it happening after the end of the Cold War, with the triumph of capitalist liberal democracy over Soviet communism. Democracy became the only game in town in much of the world. And we saw a lot of countries transitioning to democracy. So by the year 2000, we had about 63 or 64% of the countries in the world being democracies. And that meant about 123 electoral democracies, slightly fewer kind of liberal democracies, but still, it was a huge kind of positive change. My mom's family comes from Riga, from Latvia. Latvia became a democracy, right? Poland became a democracy. Hungary became a democracy. Czech Republic, and so on. So that was the sort of the heyday of the global spread of democracy. But what we've seen is that around 2000, 2001, we begin to sort of peter out. And since 2006, we've been on an accelerating global democratic recession, what's called a reverse wave. So more countries are becoming more authoritarian, fewer countries are becoming democratic. Now, there are a variety of theories for why that is happening. A lot of people there are different theories. Some of them really have to do with economics. They have to do with rising inequality, or with a kind of middle-class disappointment with stagnating wages and so on. Other people place an emphasis on changes in technology, especially social media, that has kind of polarized us. And others point to deeper cultural, psychological changes of identity, the kind of rise of identity politics, etc. I tend to think that there's an element of truth in each of these different theories, but we don't yet understand what's going on. When you're living through a cultural or psychological revolution, it's very hard to really know in real time what's going on. But the point is that those forces, whether they are, and there's another dimension, of course, which is the rise of authoritarian powers like China in the international system, right? So if in the 1990s, democracy was the only game in town because America was so dominant, today we live in a much more contested world, and that means that some countries are attracted to the Chinese way of doing things, or the Russian way of doing things, or the Iranian way of doing things, right? So all of these things are happening at the same time, and all of these things are affecting us and posing a challenge to liberal democracy, whether that's in the United States, which has also become very polarized, whether that's in Europe, if you sort of follow European politics, if you look at what's happening in France, in Italy, in Sweden, in Germany, in Holland, places where we thought democracy was, or a liberal democracy was unassailable. There are some real weaknesses and real tensions there.
The pendulum is swinging. It seems like it's swinging in a different...
and it seems to be getting worse, okay? So I say that in order to emphasize the fact that the tensions that we have in Israel today are not unique to Israel. There are some aspects that are more localized and sort of really have to do with Jewish political culture, Israeli political culture, relations between Jews and Arabs in Israel, etc. But a lot of the issues that we are facing are being faced and being contended with really all around the world. And that also means that we have an opportunity in Israel. We have an opportunity to think about these issues. In many respects, Israel is a laboratory for a diverse society. And if we can make it in the Middle East, others can as well. So that is to say that what is happening now, which I know is very painful to many Israelis, including to myself, I think instinctually we're people who seek agreement and seek cohesion, and that's very, very important for Israel. But there's also a real opportunity here for Israel to work through issues that we've kind of neglected perhaps over the last few decades, questions of identity, of constitutionalism. But also we need to bear in mind that many of the challenges that we are facing, if we can make meaningful progress on those in Israel, we'll actually have a lot of really important lessons for the world.
Yeah. So that's, I mean, that is a hopeful message. You know, this idea that because of the, you know, on the one hand, the fact that the story in Israel isn't unique, right? So we're on par in a way, but maybe it is the unique elements that can kind of help model, because we're such a in many ways, with all our, you know, with all the challenges, we are a robust democracy, a way that can model maybe for other societies, other countries. You know, we are nearing the end, but I do want to, I think it's important, especially as we're thinking about, you know, trying to be solution oriented, right? If there are four components that deal with the four pillars that are necessary for a liberal democracy, right? And we can't go into all of them, right? But this something that's very powerful that sticks out to me, right? So the four is, you know, the legitimacy of the government, the agreement on the mechanism of government, the right to use power internally and externally, force, right? And this, you know, this shared narrative, which is incredibly important. The story that we're telling, and if we're looking at anybody who's following what's happening in Israel, there's basically, you know, all of those pieces are kind of up in the air, right? If it's the fact that for the first time in a very significant way, many in the military are now saying that they are no longer able to kind of volunteer because of the implications of the direction these think the country is going to. If it's, you know, the argument about the structure themselves, right? The language of, you know, this government doesn't have legitimacy, right? All these things are coming up and up again. And above all, I think that what is, on the one hand, quite sobering, but also what I think is a great opportunity is the fact that we're realizing that the narratives that carried us to this moment are no longer there, right? And the stories that we're telling ourselves, right? You know, there are a lot of sectors in Israel, each kind of vying for power and to promote their own a community, sometimes over the others, and that's true for maybe, you know, for those who live in the settlements or the ultra-Orthodox, or even, you know, secular Israelis are kind of pushing in the other direction, and not to mention, of course, the huge population of Israeli Arabs and Palestinians who are also in the mix. Not to mention what's happening with the ongoing conflict. All of this is like this big hot mess, but there's also an opportunity, I think, to kind of to check ourselves and see what is the story that we need to tell. And I'm just curious, you know, it's like.
No, so that's really I think very, very astute and very important, and I think that here too there's a very revealing paradox in what has happened in Israel. The paradox is that in some respects Israel is more democratic today, certainly more pluralistic today than it was in the early decades of the state. There are more voices being heard in Israeli society that were not so visible in the past. And that includes Israeli Arabs, that includes members of the GLBTQ community. That also includes in many respects communities that were disempowered in the early decades of statehood, particularly Jews who came from Arab countries, so Mizrahim, Sfaradim. So in many respects, Israeli society is more inclusive, more open, more pluralistic today. Okay, which is a great thing and an important and an important thing. Paradoxically, that greater pluralism so far has also undermined that shared narrative. So we've had this paradoxical situation where on the one hand we're hearing more voices, and on the other hand we haven't yet created a shared Israeliness that is able to accommodate that diversity. And I think in many respects that is the challenge for us going forward. Because in order to have a functioning democracy, yes, you need plurality of voices. I think diversity is a strength. I think it's one of the great strengths of Israel. But you also need to have the mechanisms and the leadership that is able to take those different voices and to make sure that they sing as a choir, and it doesn't become a holy mess, as you say. And I think that is a key challenge for us, and it will involve a kind of renegotiation, if we're able to do it. It will involve a renegotiation of the Israeli social contract, and in some respects, the meaning of Israeliness. Historically, Israel was able to integrate people from incredibly diverse backgrounds into a certain Israeliness, which I think was very powerful. But let's admit it, it was also quite restrictive. And it also tended to be kind of top-down, and it tended to subdue pre-existing identities and not to give voice and expression to those. That has changed over the last few decades, but it's created these problems of cohesiveness and of coherence. And I think we focus on Netanyahu's legal problems, or we focus on the latest piece of legislation, but fundamentally, that is what our collective challenge is. How do we reinvent Israeliness, or find a formula of Israeliness that is open, attractive, inclusive, and that allows that diversity to exist in a coherent and cohesive way. That is fundamentally our challenge, and it will be a great adventure and a great journey for the people of Israel, but also for Jewish communities around the world. I really want to emphasize that. This is not just an internal Israeli struggle. It's really a struggle for the soul of Israel and of Jewish peoplehood. And so that is why it's incredibly important that we engage in those conversations, and that we work together to strengthen our ability to conduct difficult conversations in a constructive way.
So you couldn't have said it better, and with that, we're gonna close this episode. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
It's great to have you here, Professor Amichai Magen, to learn more about the structures and the parts of that are necessary for liberal democracies, the context in Israel, the context in the world, and this challenge that we have and this opportunity to really create this narrative moving forward, not only in Israel for Israeli society and the Israeli identity, but broadly speaking, also for the Jewish community and the involvement and how those two might work together. So thank you so much for joining us. And I look forward to continuing our conversation.
Me too. Thank you, Amitai. I really enjoyed this conversation.